Good afternoon. First, thanks to Chandru and Jayati for inviting me. It's been a real learning opportunity, and I've really been enjoying how we've been building on each other's presentations and work. Chandru asked me to talk about small island developing states, and what I'm trying to do in the presentation is to also talk about a paper that I'm currently working on, where I engage with kind of the landscape of climate finance for developing countries. And so I think that some of the key concepts that I bring up here and the analysis are very much relevant to small island developing states, because whatever the bind that developing countries find themselves in, the reality is that that bind is even tighter and more acute for small island developing states, right? So what I'm going to present here is a very short case study of one of World Bank's renewable energy transition initiatives that is partly funded by the Green Climate Fund, which is one of the biggest climate funds established, created by the Paris Agreement. And I use this case study to raise several questions about the model that underlines a lot of this financing, primarily blended finance or de-risking, right? We've been talking about that for 2 days here. And so I'm going to reflect on that and think about whether these blended instruments actually achieve the stated goals on their own terms, right? Or whether they fail. But before jumping into that analysis, I want to spend a few minutes talking about small island developing states and just to sort of frame the question. Next slide. Feels weird to say next slide, but thank you for doing that. Yeah, small island developing states, known as such because they're small geographically and also by population size. They're really vulnerable economically as well as environmentally. This is a photo. This is the city where I grew up in, Male, in Maldives, the capital of Maldives. So we already know that they're really vulnerable, right, when it comes to the environment. Small islands have historically been constructed as spaces of extraction, right? We know that in the Caribbean, for example, in the 17th century, there were many plantations, right, in British-controlled Barbados, in Jamaica, for example, sugar plantations, in the French colonies as well, in Haiti, right, Guadeloupe, home to major plantations. And even today, these island nations are very much dependent on exporting primary commodities, right? And in the Indian Ocean, where I come from, tourism is one of the biggest industries, and this is a highly extractive sector, right? You need a lot of resources, right, that we don't have, like fresh water. Waste management is a huge issue. And you also have to import a lot of food and fuel, which really worsens the current account deficit for these countries, right? So it puts them in a really vulnerable position economically, because a lot of this leads to high external debt, and a lot of that debt is held in foreign currency, which you see in figure 2 here, where we map climate vulnerability and external debt. And what you see from this graph is that the G7 countries have, in some ways, climate-proofed, right, their economies, and have low levels of external debt. They have high levels of debt, but low levels of external debt. Whereas the SIDS score very high, right? They're highly vulnerable in terms of the climate crisis, and also have high levels of foreign debt, which is something that we've been talking about again over the last few sessions. Next slide. So just looking at the multilateral finance landscape, so with the Paris Agreement, there were 2 deferrals, right? So from the international level to the national level, right? So the nation state, the national state is now responsible for cutting emissions. And then the second deferral is from the state to private actors, right? With the World Bank's billions to trillions, right? Maximizing finance for development program. And I argue in the paper that these 2 deferrals really place small island developing states in a really vulnerable position, right, in terms of accessing finance and so forth. And when we look at the nationally determined contributions reports from SIDS, of course, the huge emphasis is on the energy transition, right? And also ecosystem restoration. These are the two things that they tend to mention the most. And so these projects require a lot of financing, right? What we see is that for small island developing states, what the finance that is being mobilized is actually far below what is actually needed, right, to achieve the green transition. And so in 2019, SIDS received $1.5 billion, whereas according to the UN, they need $92 billion in order to achieve their NDCs. And this is not even fully costing for all of the goals that they set out in their NDCs. And the reason why I focus on the Green Climate Fund is because they're the largest contributor to the SIDS. And because the Green Climate Fund in some ways addresses some of the shortcomings of the multilateral financial landscape when it comes to climate finance. And one of the ways in which it does this is we know that when it comes to climate finance, there's a lot of money for mitigation and not enough for adaptation. But the GCF tries to rectify this by mandating that we invest 50% of resources to mitigation and 50% to adaptation. And what you see in these graphs over in figures 6 and 7 is that the GCF has mobilized quite a bit of financing, right, in terms of mitigation and adaptation for SIDS. And the lower graph, figure 7, shows how seems to be an equal split, right, between adaptation and mitigation, and cross-cutting on the other hand. So that's one way in which the Green Climate Fund helps to address a flaw in the climate finance landscape, which helps the states because they need a lot of financing for adaptation. Next slide. So then I'm going to focus on two reasons that the lenders identify as being limitations, right, in mobilizing these funds. One of the challenges they identify is that the SIDS have very limited absorptive capacity, right? And here, the idea is that SIDS have to deal with multiple funds, and each of these funds has its own complexities, and so there's not enough know-how and knowledge, right, in SIDS institutions to receive these funds, and that there's limited availability of trained staff. And this is portrayed as a particularly acute problem for microstates, right, where disbursements lag behind commitments more than they do for the SIDS group as a whole, right? And so recognizing this, the Green Climate Fund actually provides funding for what they call a readiness program to help countries build institutional capacity. So this is the second way in which they try and address this. But of course, being social scientists, we know that there's always rival hypotheses, right? Why do disbursements lag behind commitments? So another reason, the next slide, would be the attractiveness of these projects in the SIDS, right? How interested are private actors. Of course, one thing to mention here is that adaptation is difficult to quantify, so it's difficult to get financing for adaptation. But even for mitigation, it's difficult to establish the business case for mitigation funds in the SIDS because of scalability concerns, right? You expect smaller returns on investment because they're small islands, not a lot of people, right? And so that's one of the reasons why you mobilize less funds for mitigation projects as well in small island developing states. And another reason identified in a GCF independent evaluation report is that there's extremely high transaction costs when it comes to small island developing states, right? Because they're small, they're remote, right? There's not a lot of production capacity. Internally, you have to import a lot of stuff, and you have to provide a series of bankable projects, which sometimes is not necessarily the case for these small island developing states. So transaction costs are high, and so are implementation and procurement costs. Okay, next slide. And then another challenge is that a lot of the SIDS actually have middle to upper income status. And so this means that they're closed off from accessing concessional finance, right? But the problem here is that the income status does not really map onto your sovereign risk, right? The rating agencies don't look at the income status, right? They look at your public debt levels, your growth potential, and so forth. So, for example, the Maldives, which has upper middle income status, don't really have access to international capital markets at good rates, right? So that's a huge problem for SIDS. So this is kind of what the literature talks about, right? Some of the difficulties that SIDS face in accessing climate finance. And in my paper, I primarily engaged with this concept of creditworthiness. And this is, you've already seen this chart from Tim's presentation today. So creditworthiness, you can define as the asymmetric ability of an entity to set the terms of lending to a less creditworthy entity, right? So this, in a sense, captures a power dynamic, right? So there's an entity that is more powerful, it's more creditworthy, setting the terms for you on how much you can lend and borrow, how much you can borrow, right? So you could think of this domestically as, for example, the central bank, right, is a more creditworthy entity than a commercial bank in most cases, and so the central bank can define the terms of that lending. And so this is a real challenge, right? In the international space, we've had recently a paper by Quentin Bruno that I think neatly captures this dynamic, where the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, in creating the guidelines for capital requirements under Basel I, created an international hierarchy of sovereign borrowers, right? Essentially, what the Basel Committee said was the sovereign debt of OECD countries and the countries that had signed on to IMF's general agreements to borrow were essentially risk-free, right? So they didn't have any problem accessing markets, whereas international capital markets, whereas banks were reluctant to lend to the other sovereigns, the rest of the countries, right? Because no banks likes to have idle capital, right, in terms of holding capital requirements. And so in doing this, the Basel Committee essentially handpicked, right, sovereigns that were creditworthy. And that creditworthiness was in many ways determined by level of industrial development, right, sound economic performance, democratic institutions, competitive market economy, openness to capital flows, and overall stability, partly defined as not being a third world country exposed to political and military risk, right? So there are obviously biases in subjectivity, right, in when it comes to defining who is creditworthy and who is not, right? So of course this was changed under Basel II, where now we rely on very fancy risk assessments like value at risk models and so forth. But then this again begs the question, right? How is this risk actually measured, the sovereign risk? In sovereign credit ratings, you have two components, right? Part of it is data-driven, you could say, looking at ability of countries to repay debt. But then there's a huge discretionary component to this, right? It depends on the judgment of somebody sitting at a desk to say, what are the political risks of Honduras, for example, right? And what would be their willingness to pay, right? How would their labor laws change? Or would they try and expropriate property, right? So all of these questions come up. So there's a huge discretionary component to deciding who is creditworthy. And so the question then becomes, how do you build creditworthiness, right? I mean, all of this goes to the question of cost of capital. That's where I'm going with this, right? So how do you build creditworthiness? In mainstream literature would tell us, right, you need to have better taxation, you need to have good fiscal capacity of the state, develop financial markets to mobilize internal credit, strengthen regulatory regimes, create business-friendly policies. In short, you just have to generate real economic growth, right, and have good institutions. This is how you build creditworthiness. But the problem is, to do that, countries have to borrow, right? But then when they borrow, they get penalized, right? So what the challenge for a lot of global south countries is that in order to improve creditworthiness in the long run, they have to make big investments today, right? But then the increase in debt would register as, it would be penalized, right? And so these models, in some ways, the ways in which credit rating agencies look at developing countries, right? These models are stacked against countries' ability to break through this glass ceiling, right? To achieve good credit ratings. Yeah, so one of the kind of concepts, so this is one of the key concepts I engage with in the paper, and it's a broad reflection on the financial architecture to say that it does not really allow countries a pathway to build this kind of creditworthiness and excess capital. Okay, the next slide. Oh, sorry, I should actually go back and explain the chart. If you could go back. Yeah, so for small island developing states, sovereign risk, right, creditworthiness, is really becomes a huge problem because of climate risk, right? What this graph shows us is that already sovereigns have poor ratings, right, because of dependence on food and fuel imports. They have high external debts. And then they may go through defaulting or restructuring, right, which impacts the credit rating. And on top of that, climate vulnerability can also lead to points being lopped off of your credit rating. So actually, a recent paper showed that across all countries, an increase in climate vulnerability by 1 percentage point was associated with the 0.2 decrease in creditworthiness, right? And this penalty is over 3 times more when the sample is restricted to developing countries alone. So it's a huge, huge issue. Okay, and then I look at the different risks and constraints for for mobilizing private finance in the global south. We often talk about project risks and macro risks, and this is something that the International Energy Agency has focused a lot on, and also Avinash Prasad has written about this. But there's also factors we need to consider from the institutional investor's perspective, right? Their fiduciary duty requirements, shareholder commitments, and so forth. Next slide. And this is just to show the borrowing costs, right, how they differ on long-term, like 10-year bonds between the G7 and the SIDS. Moving on. Okay, so in the paper, I look at the Sustainable Renewables Risk Mitigation Initiative, which was established by the World Bank through its Energy Sector Management Assistance Program, and it's mostly funded by the Green Climate Fund, but with co-financing from other partners. And then the goal is to really mobilize private investments into financing solar plants and other types of renewable energy projects. And small islands are also part of these projects. The Seychelles and Guinea-Bissau are in the second phase of these projects. So what I look at, this is a table I put together by looking at the types of risks that the initiative identifies, right? So there are primarily 2 types, the micro risks associated with the project and then macro risks, right? And then they describe what the risks are. I think we're very familiar with a lot of these risks, right? Off-taker risks, whether the investor will be paid, right? And so to mitigate that, you will have power purchase agreements and the like, and the bank also provides guarantees for this. And then to de-risk for the rest, you have public investment to strengthen the grid infrastructure. This is something that Pablo was talking about, right? And that comes in the form of loans, whereas risk mitigation tools are funded by guarantees. And then the second major type of risk is macro risk. And this is where the discussion of creditworthiness is really important. Next slide. Yes. Where the only de-risking instrument for these huge risks that from the investor's perspective, right, are quite large, is technical assistance, right? So project preparation, so creating a series of bankable projects. That's how they de-risk for macro risks, right? And in phase 1, it was 23 million that was assigned for this. In phase 2, 37 million, whereas for the other parts of the de-risking, they assigned 1.4 billion in one case and 996 million in the other case. So this is not a priority for, it seems, for the World Bank and the GCF. And I think this is why we see that even when you de-risk, the cost of capital still remains quite high for developing countries, right? And so I think one of the takeaways from here is that the actual de-risking that would bring down the cost of capital is not providing these small like fixes on the on the side, but it's actually doing structural transformation that we've been talking about here. The first step would be debt forgiveness and debt reduction, right? But then, of course, going into things like trade policy, natural resource management, ownership, right? Otherwise, you would be stuck in a cycle. So I think the cost of capital is going to remain high if investors perceive these countries to be risky, but they can't get out of that because of the architecture of the global financial system, right? Next slide. Yeah, and so we're stuck, right? We're stuck in this the climate investment trap, and we're all very familiar with this. I think we've been talking about different parts of this and all of this for 2 days. Next slide. And so we end up in a situation where the most vulnerable countries pay the highest cost for the renewable energy transition, right? So I think one takeaway, again, is to say that we really need to focus our energies beyond just debt reduction and debt forgiveness to thinking about structural transformations that will bring about credible or credit-worthy states that don't have to pay this exorbitant price of capital, right, to international financial institutions. Thank you.